Melinda Beardsley. On the afternoon of December 17, 1977, a couple visiting the mountains of Northern California stopped to let their dog stretch its legs along Interstate 80. A short walk off the highway, near a place called Emigrant Gap, they found the body of a woman lying in a bank of fresh snow. She had no identification on her, no missing person report attached to anyone matching her description. And for the next 49 years, she would have no name at all. The woman was Melinda Beardsley, though the people who loved her knew her as Pip. She had been born in 1946 in rural Michigan, just north of Detroit, the youngest of 6 children. And her family remembered an energetic girl with a dimpled smile and an easy sense of humor. By her 20s, she had drifted west and settled for a time in Carson City, Nevada, where she worked as a server. She was a mother of 2. The last confirmed proof that Melinda was alive came from an ordinary piece of public record. Her name appeared in a 1976 Reno newspaper in connection with a minor arrest, and after that, the paper trail of her life simply stopped. She was somewhere in her early 30s. Within roughly a year of that final trace, she would be found in the snow off the interstate. And the distance between those 2 moments, a routine entry in a local paper and an anonymous body in the mountains, is a gap her family would spend the rest of their lives trying to close. When she was found, investigators could describe her only in the barest terms. A white woman, somewhere between 25 and 35 years old, roughly 5 feet 8, with short dark hair, brown eyes, and pierced ears. She wore a removable partial denture across her 4 upper front teeth, and she had died by strangulation. In 1978, the Placer County Sheriff's Office did the most thorough thing available to them at the time. They made close to 300 copies of her fingerprints and mailed them to law enforcement agencies across the United States and Canada, hoping that someone, somewhere, would recognize the pattern of ridges that belonged to only one person on Earth. Not a single agency wrote back with a match. The years kept moving, and Melinda stayed nameless. Her fingerprints were run a second time in 2006, and the silence that came back was exactly the same. In 2011, her remains were exhumed so that newer science could be tried against them. A partial genetic profile came back in 2018, and more work followed in 2019. But none of it was suitable for the kind of family tree analysis that was just beginning to break cases like hers open. When investigators tried again in 2024, they were told the remains had degraded too far to give them anything usable at all. By then, she had been in the ground, unclaimed, for nearly half a century, remembered by strangers as little more than the woman found in the snow. So how do you return a name to someone who was never even reported missing in the first place? The answer came from 2 directions at once. In 2025, forensic specialists were finally able to pull a usable profile from additional portions of her remains, the kind of profile that could be run against public genealogy databases. At the same time, a nonprofit group called Moxie Forensic Investigations had been working a completely separate thread. Melinda's own family had known for years that a relative had simply disappeared, and they had reached out to a volunteer network that referred them to Moxie, who then worked with Reno police to file the missing person report that had never actually existed. When the genealogy and the family's long search finally met in the middle, the coroner collected a cheek swab from a close relative. The confirmation came in February of 2026, and on March 18, 2026, Placer County announced that the woman in the snow finally had her name back. As of the summer of 2026, Melinda Beardsley's case is an open and active homicide investigation. No suspect has been publicly named, and the question of who took her life on that mountain highway sits almost exactly where it sat in 1977. What has changed is that the people looking for answers now know who they are looking for. One of the investigators who helped restore her identity described it simply, saying that every unidentified person is someone's child, someone's sibling, or someone's parent, and that giving Melinda back her name gave her back her dignity. Melinda Beardsley waited nearly half a century for anyone to even file the paperwork saying she was gone. The next case is almost the exact reverse. A young father whose family knew he was missing within hours, who reported it the very same day, and who still spent more than 2 decades waiting to learn what had become of him. Marcus Rutledge. In the summer of 1998, a young woman in Nashville could not reach her boyfriend, so she drove to his apartment to check on him. The door gave way to an empty home, but his dog was still there, shut in the bathroom with no food and no water. Marcus Rutledge had walked out of his own life without a word to anyone, and it would take 26 years to find out where he had gone. Marcus was 23 years old, and he had come to Nashville from Ypsilanti, Michigan. He had told his family he was a senior at Tennessee State University, and he was the father of 2 young children. The people who knew him remembered a young man who had played in the band, loved his instruments, played football and soccer, and talked about one day becoming a veterinarian. He was also, according to police, involved in selling small amounts of marijuana to college students. He was last seen on June 8, 1998, at his apartment on Parkdale Drive, and when his girlfriend found the place abandoned that day, she reported him missing immediately. His family began the long and helpless work of waiting. A few weeks later, on July 1st, his red 1995 Plymouth Neon turned up abandoned at an apartment complex roughly 21 miles across the city. The car offered no answers, only a wider circle of questions, and after that, the trail simply went quiet. For his family, those first weeks set the shape of the next quarter century. There was just enough evidence to prove that something had gone wrong, and nowhere near enough to say what. A grown man does not usually leave his dog shut in a bathroom on purpose, and he does not usually abandon his own car miles from home, and then never touch a bank account or call a relative again. But acting on that instinct meant finding him, and Marcus was nowhere to be found. The missing person report stayed open, technically active and practically frozen, for more than a decade. For more than 12 years, there was nothing. Then, on December 8, 2010, a hunter walking through the woods near Pecan Valley Road came across a human skull lying about 30 yards off the road. No other remains were ever recovered at the scene, and with almost nothing to work from, the case was filed under a placeholder name, the Pecan Valley John Doe. The medical examiner managed to extract a DNA sample from the skull and entered it into the National Criminal Database. But there was no one on the other side of that database to match it to, and the cause of death could not be determined. The two halves of the story, a missing young father in 1998 and an unidentified skull in 2010, sat in separate files for years, each unaware of the other. The genetic profile pulled from the skull had been waiting in that criminal database the entire time, a key with no lock it had yet been tried against. In 2020, a Nashville cold case detective reopened the missing person report and began pulling at it again. One detail had never quite fit. Marcus had told his family he was a senior at the university, but a closer look revealed that he had actually dropped out and was no longer enrolled, a small deception that had quietly widened the gap between the life his family believed he was living and the one he was actually living. So how do you connect a name to a set of remains when the two have been sitting in different files for over a decade? In 2023, investigators sent the evidence from the skull to a private forensics laboratory in Texas, which built a fuller genetic profile and began developing leads through family trees. A separate tip pointed detectives in the same direction. And when a member of Marcus's family provided a DNA sample, it matched the profile that had been sitting untouched in the criminal database since 2010. In January of 2025, the family was finally told what had happened to him. 14 years after the skull was found, and 26 years after he vanished, the Pekin Valley John Doe was Marcus Rutledge. Foul play is suspected in his disappearance, though no cause of death has been established and no one has been arrested or charged. As of the summer of 2026, the case remains open, and it has since been featured on a national investigative podcast that revisits America's missing. His father described the moment of learning the truth as finally being able to take a deep breath and exhale after so many years, and the family thanked everyone who had brought them one step closer to closure. It was not the answer they had hoped for, but after 26 years, it was, at last, an answer. Marcus Rutledge's family spent 26 years knowing exactly who was missing, even if they never knew where. Our third story takes away even that. A woman whose remains were discovered before anyone in her life understood that she was gone, and who was never reported missing at all. Denise Hartley. In June of 1993, remains belonging to a young woman were discovered near a lake in eastern Minnesota. The very next day, a second discovery was made along the banks of the Mississippi River, more than a dozen miles away and in an entirely different county. The two finds belonged to the same person, and for the next 33 years, no one could say who she was. Her name was Denise Hartley, and she was 27 years old. She was the youngest of 15 siblings, and she had last been known to her family in St. Paul. She had a young daughter, and somehow, despite all of that, she was never once reported missing. A portion of her remains was found on June 12, 1993, near Bone Lake in the town of Scandia. The following day, another portion was recovered along the Mississippi, just north of a lake on the edge of St. Paul, across a county line from the first discovery. An anonymous caller told police that the rest could be found beneath a bridge roughly 15 miles away, but a search of that location turned up nothing meaningful. Investigators were left with the grim understanding that someone had gone to deliberate lengths to make sure this woman could not be identified. And the physical evidence reflected exactly that intention. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension tried everything the era would allow. They produced a hand-drawn sketch from the skull, then a colored artist's rendering. And they circulated her description and her dental records to the National Crime Database and to every police department across a 5-state region. None of it produced a name. Over the following years, multiple attempts to extract usable DNA failed outright, and the woman found near Bone Lake remained exactly as anonymous as she had been on the day she was discovered. Whole decades passed. Her daughter grew up believing, understandably, that her mother had simply chosen to stay away. Part of what made her so difficult to find was the very thing that should have made her easy. She came from an enormous family, the youngest of 15, and yet no report ever entered the system on her behalf. When a person is never reported missing, there is no name for investigators to test their unidentified remains against, no dental chart to request, no photograph to hold up for comparison. The search can only run in one direction, outward from the remains themselves, and for 33 years, that search kept coming back empty. The geography did not help either. One part of her had been found in one county and another part in a second, and the case straddled the line between two sets of investigators, two sets of records, and two long institutional memories. How do you even begin to identify someone when the person responsible has worked so hard to erase her? The case turned when a detective took it on around 2024 and connected with a nonprofit group that specializes in genetic genealogy. A volunteer genealogist reached out, and the detective sent the portion of remains that had been recovered from the river for a fresh round of testing. This time, the science held. The family tree that emerged led investigators to Denise Hartley, and when her own daughter provided a DNA sample, the state crime lab confirmed the match. The announcement came on June 11, 2026. Roughly 33 years after she was found. The genealogist who helped identify her observed that whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to take Denise's name from her, and that giving it back was the entire purpose of the work. For Denise's daughter, the news was less a matter of closure than of shock. She had not seen her mother in more than 30 years, and she had no idea that the woman found near Bone Lake had been her all along. As of the summer of 2026, the case is an open homicide, and in a real sense, the investigation is only now beginning. As the detective on the case described it, with the identification finally made, the actual work of finding out what happened to her starts over again. The case had drawn renewed attention the year before her name was restored, when a national program spotlighted it as an unsolved cold case, and that kind of visibility is often the only thing that keeps a decades-old file from disappearing entirely. For her daughter, though, the story was never really about databases or family trees. It was about a woman she may have spent 30 years quietly believing had walked away, and who turned out never to have had that choice at all. No one has been arrested. But after 3 decades, Denise Hartley is no longer a sketch on a flyer or a description in a database. She is a person with a name. Denise Hartley's remains were carried across county lines by someone who wanted her lost forever. In the next case, the distance between where a man died and where he was finally found had nothing to do with human hands at all. It was the work of open water, and it carried him from one state into another. William McInnes. In June of 2021, a couple walking a trail along the shoreline of Lake Okeechobee in Florida noticed something that had washed up at the water's edge. It was a human skull. It had drifted ashore with no body beside it, no belongings, and no obvious way to trace it back to a living person. And it would take more than 4 years to learn whose it was. The man was William McInnes, born in 1969 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was a military veteran who had lived a transient life and had become estranged from his family over the years. Records showed that he had moved between 2 Florida towns during the summer of 2019. That summer was the last stretch of time anyone could confirm he was alive. The pieces of William's last known life were spread thin. In the summer of 2019, records placed him traveling between Cocoa, on Florida's Atlantic coast, and Hollywood, further to the south. He moved the way a lot of people at the far edges of society move, without a fixed address to anchor him and without close family keeping regular track of where he was. For a military veteran who had once served his country, it is a quiet kind of tragedy, the way a person can slip out of every system meant to notice them, until the only record left is the one written after they are already gone. When the skull was recovered from the eastern shoreline of the lake in Palm Beach County, forensic examiners could offer only a broad description. An adult male, possibly white or Hispanic, somewhere between his late 30s and his late 60s. He was entered into the national database that tracks the missing and the unidentified, and he was assigned a case number. But there were simply not enough leads to determine how he had died, let alone who he was. For years the case sat cold. One more set of unidentified remains in a system that holds tens of thousands of them, each one a person who belonged to someone. That figure is not an exaggeration. At any given moment, the databases that track unidentified human remains in the United States hold tens of thousands of open entries. And behind every one of them is a person who was once known and loved by somebody, now reduced to a case number and a rough physical description. Most of them are found with far less than a complete skeleton. In William's case, there was only the skull, worn down by however long it had spent in the water, which for years was simply not enough for the science of the day to work with. How do you put a name to a skull that the lake delivered on its own, with nothing else beside it to go on? In 2025, the Sheriff's Cold Case Unit sent the evidence to a private laboratory that specializes in building genetic profiles from difficult and degraded remains. Using advanced genome sequencing and a rapid method for measuring how closely two people are related to each other, the lab developed leads that pointed toward a specific family. That September, detectives traveled out of state to meet likely relatives in person and to collect DNA samples directly. The comparison confirmed the identification on October 27, 2025, and the sheriff's office announced it publicly in January of 2026. The skull that the lake had delivered to the shoreline belonged to William McInnes. There is something worth pausing on in that detail. Detectives got on a plane and flew to another state to sit down with people who might share a few strands of DNA with a skull found on a Florida shoreline. It is slow, patient, human work layered on top of the laboratory science, and it is the part that no database can do on its own. Unlike the earlier cases, this one is not a confirmed homicide. The cause of William's death remains undetermined, and investigators have been careful to say that they simply do not yet know what happened to him. As of the summer of 2026, it is an open death investigation, and detectives are asking anyone who knew him or crossed paths with him between 2019 and 2021 to come forward with what they remember. A representative of the laboratory that identified him noted that the technology now exists to give names to people whose cases were once considered impossible to solve. William McInnes had grown estranged from his family and life. In death, the science reached back across that distance and returned him to them. With William McInnes, the water may simply have carried away a man who died of causes no one intended. The final case for today is the opposite kind of mystery, a woman whose body was hidden with such deliberate care that the concealment itself became the clearest evidence that a crime had ever taken place. Lori Craig. In October of 1997, someone walking through the woods near a small town in Washington state came upon human remains that had been tucked into a shallow depression in the ground and then covered over with logs. Whoever left her there had taken care to make sure she would not be found. For nearly 28 years, they very nearly succeeded in making sure she would never be named either. The woman was Lori Craig, born in 1959. She had traveled throughout Pierce County and along the southern edge of King County through towns like Lakewood and Kent. She was married, though her husband would later die of natural causes in 2020. The last time anyone could confirm she was alive was January of 1996, and like several of the others on this list, she was never reported missing. When her remains were found along a rural road near Buckley in October of 1997, she was still wearing the clothes she had died in: a university sweatshirt, a pair of pale blue jeans, and small tennis shoes trimmed in yellow and green. Examiners estimated she had been somewhere between 20 and 50 years old and stood around 5 feet 5. The way her body had been concealed, hidden in a depression and deliberately covered, told investigators almost immediately that this was not a death anyone had tried to report or explain. It was a death that someone had tried to bury, in every sense of the word. She became known only as the Pierce County Jane Doe, and she was entered into the national database in 2009, where she sat for years without a single connection ever being made. Those few belongings were, for a long time, the only story anyone could tell about her. The clothes suggested a woman living an ordinary life somewhere nearby, moving through the working towns and highway corridors of the region. The kind of person who might pass through a place without leaving much of a trace behind. Investigators knew she had traveled widely through the county and into the areas just south of Seattle. What they did not know was her name, her history, or the single most important fact of all, which was who had wanted her gone. So who was the woman that someone had gone to such lengths to hide? In October of 2023, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office sent the evidence to the same kind of forensic laboratory that had cracked the earlier cases, combining genome sequencing, genealogy, and relative comparison to build a family tree. It led them to Lori Craig. The identification was announced on April 8, 2025, nearly 28 years after she was found. And with a name finally attached to the remains, detectives described starting the homicide investigation over again from the ground up, retracing Lori's movements and those of her husband across the 2 years before she disappeared, from 1995 into 1997. Building a case from the ground up is not a figure of speech here. It means treating a homicide that is nearly 3 decades old as if it were fresh, searching for anyone who still remembers Lori or her husband, and trying to reconstruct a life that had already been reduced to a sweatshirt and a pair of shoes. There is one thread that investigators have not been willing to cut. The area where Lori traveled and died overlaps with the hunting ground of one of the most prolific killers in American history. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, was active in exactly those King and Pierce County corridors during the era when Lori vanished, and he preyed on vulnerable women moving through them. For years, he was believed to have taken the lives of dozens of women across the 1980s and into the early 90s. Many of them targeted precisely because they lived on the margins and might not be missed quickly. When reporters asked whether he could be connected to her, the sheriff's office was careful with its words. They said a link was possible, but far from certain, and they have not ruled him in or ruled him out. Ridgway himself is not going anywhere. In a 2003 plea deal that spared him the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder, and in 2011, he pleaded guilty to a 49th, the killing of a 20-year-old woman nearly 3 decades earlier. He is serving 49 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of release. Whether Lori Craig belongs on that list, or on no one's list but the person who covered her with logs, is the exact question her reopened investigation is now built to answer. As of the summer of 2026, Lori Craig's case is an active homicide investigation with no suspect named and no arrest made. What exists now, that did not exist for the previous 28 years, is a name, a history, and a map of where she was in the months before she died. The laboratory that identified her put the value of that plainly, noting that learning the truth is often heartbreaking for a family, but that it is also the only thing that ever lets them begin to move forward. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, Find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Clarence Asher. On September 5th, 2006, a 72-year-old man went out crabbing in a bay on the Oregon coast and never came home. His family searched, the authorities searched, and when no trace of him surfaced, he was declared legally dead within the year. What none of them knew was that he had already been found, roughly 2 months later and nearly 100 miles away, lying on a beach in an entirely different state. His name was Clarence Asher, though everyone in the small town of Fossil, Oregon knew him simply as Ed. Over the years, he had been the town's telephone lineman, the owner of the local variety store, a volunteer fireman and ambulance driver, and for a time its mayor. He loved antique cars, fishing, and the water. He was survived by a wife of more than 20 years, along with children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In a town the size of Fossil, a man like Ed is not a stranger to anyone. He was the person you called when the phone lines went down, the person behind the counter at the store, the voice on the ambulance when someone needed help in the middle of the night. That is part of what makes his story so difficult to absorb. A man who spent his whole life being known by everyone around him would spend his death, for nearly 20 years, as a body that no one could name. On that September day, Ed had gone out to go crabbing in Tillamook Bay along the northwest Oregon coast. He did not return, and the assumption, both then and in the years that followed, was that he had drowned. With no body recovered, the state declared him legally dead, and his family began to grieve a man that the water had taken without giving anything back. But the water had not kept him. It had simply carried him somewhere else. That November, roughly 2 months after Ed disappeared, skeletal remains washed ashore on a beach in Taholah, a small village on the Quinault Indian Reservation along the Washington coast. The remains belonged to an adult male, and beyond that, there was very little to work with. He was measured at around 5 feet 9 and estimated to have weighed somewhere between 170 and 180 pounds. But no one along that stretch of Washington coastline had any reason to connect an unidentified man on their beach with a retired mayor who had gone missing in an Oregon bay a state away. He was logged as the Grays Harbor County John Doe, and there he remained for close to 20 years. This is one of the stranger truths of the open ocean. A person can be lost in one place and delivered to another, across county lines and across state lines, far enough that the two events never seemed to belong to the same story. Ed's family in Oregon was looking for a man who had drowned close to home. The coroner in Washington was holding remains that had arrived from somewhere far off, with no local missing person report to match them against. For nearly 2 decades, those two facts sat on opposite sides of a border and never once met. So how do you reunite a man with his own name when the place he was found holds no memory of him at all? The answer, as with so many of these cases, came from genetic genealogy. In 2025, the Grays Harbor County coroner, working with a medical examiner's office and a private forensics laboratory in Texas, submitted the remains for genome sequencing and family tree analysis. A profile was built, relatives were identified, and their DNA was compared against the man who had washed ashore in Taholah. In the middle of June 2026, nearly 20 years after Ed vanished, the laboratory in the coroner's office announced that the Grays Harbor County John Doe was Clarence Asher. His was one of dozens of Washington cases that same laboratory had helped resolve. A quiet accumulation of restored names that rarely makes headlines, but means everything to the families involved. The funding that made the testing possible had come through the state itself. credited to Washington's governor, its attorney general, and its legislature. There is no criminal case here, and there was never any suggestion of one. Everything about Ed's death is consistent with an accidental drowning, exactly as his family had always understood it. As of the summer of 2026, the case is considered resolved, closed not by an arrest, but by an answer. His remains had drifted from the Oregon coast, where he was last alive, to the Washington shore, where a stranger found him, and it took the science of 2 decades later to trace that journey back to its beginning. Ed Asher was never a mystery of who or why. He was a mystery of where, and after 20 years, even that finally had a solution. Ed Asher's death was almost certainly an accident, the tide carrying an old man home the long way around. The case that follows leaves no such room for doubt. A woman found in a place no accident could ever have brought her, with every sign that someone had put her there on purpose. Joyce Ann Hinson. For more than 40 years, a woman in Texas grew up believing that her mother had abandoned her. She had no reason to think anything else. Her mother had left one day and simply never come back, and no one could tell her where she had gone. The truth, when it finally arrived, was that her mother had not walked away at all. She had been found in a landfill west of Fort Worth in the summer of 1984, and for 42 years, no one knew her name. Her name was Joyce Ann Hinson, and her parents lived in Tennessee. She was known to travel widely, often by hitchhiking, moving back and forth across state lines. In late 1983, she had briefly returned to her parents' home before setting off again. The last her family heard from her was a phone call to her mother, in which she said she was passing through Texas. It was an era when a young woman moving that way on her own and by the kindness of strangers could slip out of everyone's sight without alarm bells ringing for years. People assumed she was simply somewhere else. Her parents were in Tennessee. Her travels carried her across several states, and a gap in contact was easy to explain away until it stretched on too long to explain at all. By the time anyone might have started to worry in earnest, the trail had already gone cold. In July of 1984, a body was discovered at a landfill west of Fort Worth in Tarrant County. She had been left there after her death, transported to the site from somewhere else, and the condition of the remains made identification impossible at the time. Investigators were able to determine that she had died by strangulation and that her hands had been bound. Beyond those grim facts, she was a woman without a name, without a hometown, without anyone stepping forward to report her missing. Her case was entered into the records as a Tarrant County Jane Doe, and the biological evidence gathered during that original investigation was carefully preserved, in the hope that a future no one could yet imagine might someday be able to use it. That future was a long time coming. For 42 years, Joyce Ann Hinson remained unidentified, one more unnamed woman in a national database. And somewhere across all those years, her own daughter was growing up with a private wound, the belief that her mother had chosen to leave her behind. It is one of the quiet cruelties of an unidentified case. The people left behind are not only denied their answers, they are sometimes handed the wrong story entirely and left to carry it for a lifetime. So what does it take to give a name back to a woman who had been erased so completely that even her own family had stopped looking for her? The work began in 2025, when the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with a private forensics laboratory to build a genetic profile from the preserved evidence. By February of 2026, that profile had produced a connection to a family surname, Hinson, and when investigators followed it, a man came forward to say that his sister, Joyce Ann Hinson, had vanished back in late 1983. His DNA was built into a comparison profile, and by that spring the science had confirmed that the two of them were full siblings. To settle it beyond any doubt, the medical examiner and the FBI matched a set of partial fingerprints taken from the remains decades earlier against an arrest record from 1981. It was a rare identification built on 3 separate confirmations stacked one atop another. The genealogy that pointed to a family, the sibling DNA that proved the relationship, and the fingerprint that reached back into her own lifetime. Together, they left no room for doubt. The woman in the landfill was Joyce Ann Hinson. With her name restored, the case became an open and active homicide investigation once again. Reopened with a renewed sense of purpose. One of the officials involved in the identification described it as work that had been left undone, and made clear they did not intend to stop until it was finished. Another investigator put the mission even more plainly, saying that the goal is simply for everyone to have a name. As of the summer of 2026, no one has been arrested for what happened to Joyce Ann Hinson. But the daughter who spent a lifetime believing her mother had abandoned her now knows the truth, however hard it is to hold. Her mother had not left her. Her mother had been taken from her. Joyce Ann Hinson was hidden deliberately, discarded in a place designed to swallow whatever people want to disappear. The next man was concealed by something else entirely. Not by anyone covering their tracks, but by the passage of so much time that when he was finally unearthed, investigators assumed his bones belonged to history. Edwin Mowry. In the summer of 1983, workers digging along the side of a building in Prescott, Arizona, broke ground on something strange. Buried in the earth were a human skull, a scattering of animal bones, and a time capsule. The time capsule threw everyone off. It suggested age, history, something long since settled. And so the assumption at first was that these were old remains, possibly from another century entirely. They were not. They belonged to a young man who had been alive well within living memory, and it would take more than 40 years to learn who he was. His name was Edwin Mowry, known to his family as Ed. He was a Vietnam veteran from Ash Fork, Arizona, a small town more than 50 miles north of Prescott. By the accounts of his relatives, he had come home from the war and was attending college in the area, and his sister would later wonder aloud whether he had returned carrying wounds that no one could see. Sometime in the early 1970s, after leaving his parents' home, he disappeared. He was, in that sense, part of a larger and quieter pattern. Young men who came back from Vietnam and struggled to find their footing again, some of them drifting away from families and communities that never fully understood what they were carrying. When one of them fell out of contact, it was too often read as a choice rather than a crisis. And the search that might have followed any other missing person sometimes never began at all. Exactly when he vanished is something even his own family cannot fully agree on. His brother's account placed it as early as 1971. His sister remembered it as 1974. The officials who later worked the case settled on the broader description of the early 1970s. What is not in dispute is that he left, and that for decades afterward, no one knew what had become of him. He became a name that surfaced only in family memories, a Vietnam veteran who had survived the war and then quietly slipped away from everyone who knew him. When his remains were found in 1983, the presence of that time capsule sent the investigation in the wrong direction almost from the start. Believing the burial might be historic, examiners did not initially treat it as a recent death. Eventually, the remains were determined to belong to a white male who had been somewhere between 30 and 40 years old when he died. And the case was entered into the National Database of the Unidentified. But there was no name to attach to it. and no missing person report that lined up. And the skull that had been dug up beside a time capsule settled into decades of anonymity of its own. There is something almost cruel in the coincidence of that time capsule. A container meant to preserve a community's memory of itself, buried in the same ground as a man whose identity was about to be lost for 2 generations. The object that was supposed to speak to the future ended up steering the people investigating away from the truth for decades. How do you identify a man whose remains were mistaken for a relic in a case that had gone cold before anyone even realized there was a case at all? The answer arrived in 2025, when the Yavapai County Medical Examiner and Sheriff's Office submitted the remains to a private forensics laboratory for genome sequencing and genealogical analysis. The work was paid for in part by an online crowdfunding campaign and in part through a federally supported program that helps cover exactly this kind of testing. That the effort was funded partly by strangers donating over the internet says something about how these cases get solved now, through a mix of official work and ordinary public goodwill. On June 18, 2026, the identification was announced. The man buried beside the time capsule in Prescott was Edwin Mowry, the Vietnam veteran who had disappeared from Ash Fork more than half a century earlier. What is still not known is how Ed Mowry died. Officials have not released a cause or a manner of death, and it remains genuinely open whether his death involved a crime, an accident, or something else altogether. As of the summer of 2026, there is no reported suspect and no active criminal case attached to his name. But neither is there a clear account of how his remains came to be buried where they were found. Much of what is known about his life comes not from official records, but from a brother's obituary and a sister's memories, the fragments a family holds onto when someone goes missing, and the years keep stretching on. After more than 50 years, they at least know where he ended up. The rest, for now, stays unanswered. Edwin Mowry vanished close to home, a local man who slipped away into the Arizona landscape he had grown up in. The woman in the next case came from another country altogether, and the distance between where she disappeared and where she was found is measured not in miles, but in the full width of a continent. Jeanette Marcotte. Sometime around 1981, a young woman in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan told the people around her that she was heading west to Vancouver and set off. She never arrived, and she was never seen alive again. What no one in Canada could have guessed was that her journey did not end anywhere near the west coast. It ended thousands of miles in the opposite direction in a wooded stretch of central Florida, where her remains would lie unidentified for more than 4 decades. Her name was Jeanette Marcotte, and she was Canadian. The last anyone could place her was in Saskatchewan, in either 1981 or 1982, when she said she was bound for Vancouver, British Columbia. She was estimated to have been somewhere between 20 and 50 years old. And then, for a very long time, she was simply gone. A missing person who crosses an international border becomes one of the hardest cases there is. The records that might identify her sit in one country's systems, while her remains sit in another's, and the two rarely speak to each other. A woman reported missing in Saskatchewan, and a set of unidentified remains in Florida existed in entirely separate worlds, with no obvious reason for anyone to think of connecting them. That is exactly the kind of gap these cases fall into and vanish. In January of 1985, skeletal remains were discovered in a densely wooded area near Malabar, Florida, southeast of Orlando. There was a particularly unsettling detail to the discovery. Jeanette's remains were found intermingled with those of a second woman, Kimberly Walker, who was identified at the time through her dental records. Jeanette could not be. She could not be linked to any missing person, from Florida or anywhere else, and so she became the Malabar Jane Doe, entered into the national database, while the other woman found beside her was given back her name. For 41 years, that is how it stayed. There is a long shadow that hangs over the woods where the two women were found. At the time, a man named John Crutchley lived in Malabar, and he would go on to become one of the more notorious figures in Florida's criminal history, known in the press as the Vampire Rapist. In late 1985, he abducted a 19-year-old hitchhiker, held her captive, and drained a large amount of her blood before she managed to escape and bring about his arrest. He was convicted of rape and kidnapping, though he was never convicted of taking anyone's life. According to a county spokesperson, Crutchley was long a theory in both of the deaths in those woods, in part because the driver's license of the woman found beside Jeanette was reportedly discovered in his desk, alongside those of several other women who had died. He is not able to answer for any of it now. He died in prison in 2002. So how do you identify a woman who vanished from one country and surfaced, nameless, in another, with no missing report anywhere to bridge the gap between them? The identification came through a combination of forensic science and cross-border genealogy. In 2024, using a federal grant intended for exactly these kinds of unresolved cases, a state law enforcement agency, a county sheriff's office, and a medical examiner submitted the evidence to a private laboratory, which built a genetic profile from the remains. A team of forensic genetic genealogists then traced the family tree that profile revealed, following it back across the border into Canada. Following a family line from a set of remains in Florida all the way into rural Canada is painstaking work, the kind that can take a specialized team many months of tracing births, marriages, and records across a border and across decades. In late January of 2026, 41 years after she was found in those Florida woods, the Malabar Jane Doe was identified as Jeanette Marcotte. Her identification answers the question of who she was, but not the question of what happened to her. As with the woman found beside her, Jeanette's cause of death remains undetermined, and the theory connecting both deaths to John Crutchley remains exactly that, a theory never proven and now impossible to test in any courtroom. As of the summer of 2026, the case is unresolved as to how she died. The county spokesperson acknowledged as much, noting that families in these cases can be given a name, but not always the other particulars, the why and the how that would finally let them rest. For a family in Canada that lost track of her more than 40 years ago, even a name without an explanation is far more than they had held for most of their lives. Jeanette Marcotte has hers back. The rest of her story is still missing. Jeanette Marcotte was found alongside another victim, the two of them bound together in a single grim discovery. The last man in our account was found entirely alone, high in the mountains of Arizona, with nothing beside him but the gear he had carried in and the question of how he came to die there. David Resnick. On a winter day in 1976, hikers in the Baboquivari Mountains of southern Arizona came upon skeletal remains on a high ridge a few miles south of the Kitt Peak Observatory. Scattered around him was nearly everything he had carried: a backpack, a pair of sturdy boots, a hatchet, a plastic tarp. He had clearly climbed up there on his own, prepared for the outdoors. But he had never come back down, and for the next 50 years, no one could say who he was. His name was David Resnick, and he went by Dave. He was a United States Army medic who had served in the Vietnam War, and by the time he disappeared, he was believed to be living in Tucson. Officials would later estimate that he vanished sometime around 1972. He was in his 20s. As an Army medic, Dave would have been the one other soldiers depended on in their worst moments. The person trained to keep others alive under fire. There is a particular sadness in a man like that, dying alone on a mountainside with no one to help him, and in his family never learning, for 50 years, that this was how his story had come to an end. When his remains were found in February of 1976 on that ridge in the Babokivari range, the personal effects around him told the story of a man equipped for the wilderness. He had blue denim jeans, a blue and red shirt, a pair of hiking boots, a green aluminum-framed backpack, a hatchet with its scabbard, and an orange tarp. Examiners initially estimated he had been a young white male, somewhere between 18 and 24 years old. But an estimate is not a name, and no missing person report matched him. He was entered into the records as the Kit Peak John Doe, and the mountains held onto his identity for half a century. Those belongings painted a clear picture of what he had been doing up there. This was not someone who had wandered off or been left behind by accident. He had packed deliberately, carried real equipment, and set out into rugged country the way an experienced outdoorsman would. Whatever happened to him happened to a person who believed he was prepared for it, which is often the most dangerous frame of mind to be in when conditions turn. The Babokivari Mountains are beautiful and remote, sacred ground to the Tohono O'odham people, and utterly indifferent to anyone caught out in them when the weather changes. A storm at that elevation can arrive fast and leave a person with nowhere to go. What makes his case especially hard to sit with is that his family never stopped searching. In the early 1970s, as Dave slipped out of contact, his relatives placed advertisements in newspapers in both Hawaii and Arizona, printing his photograph alongside messages from his father and his sister in California, pleading with him to reach out. They were looking for him in the pages of newspapers around the very time his remains were lying undiscovered on an Arizona ridge. Their appeals went unanswered because the person they were addressing was already beyond reach, and they would spend decades never understanding why he had gone silent. So how do you finally answer a family's 50-year-old question when the man they had been looking for was lying nameless in the mountains the entire time? The resolution came through the same forensic approach that closed so many of these cases. In September of 2024, the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office submitted the evidence to a private laboratory for genome sequencing and genealogical analysis, followed by comparison with living relatives. In June of 2026, the identification was announced, alongside that of another Arizona veteran whose case had been resolved in the same stretch of time. The two Arizona veterans, Dave Resnick and Edwin Mowry, should be identified within the same short span, both of them men who had served and then vanished. Says a great deal about who tends to end up nameless and for how long. The Kit Peak John Doe was David Resnick, the Army medic whose family had searched for him in newspaper advertisements half a century before. There is no criminal case attached to David Resnick. Based on where and how he was found, high on a remote ridge with all of his gear around him, officials suspect he may have died of exposure, possibly caught in a snowstorm in country that can turn unforgiving without warning. His cause of death is formally undetermined, but nothing about the scene points to anyone else's involvement. As of the summer of 2026, his case is considered resolved as an identification. After 50 years, the family that once filled newspaper columns with his photograph finally learned where their long search had been leading all along. To a quiet ridge beneath the desert sky, where a young veteran had walked up into the mountains and, for reasons the years may never fully explain, never walked back down. 10 names finally returned to the people who lost them. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.